What if I told you that the most dangerous man in Europe was not a dictator or a terrorist, but a soft-spoken man from Naples who became a billionaire by mastering one simple, addictive vice? This is not a fictional thriller. This is the true, shocking saga of Michele Zaza, the man they called Lo Squalo, the shark. A name that would send ripples of fear and admiration through the underworld, from the smoky backrooms of Italy to the highest echelons of political power. But before we dive into this deep, dark ocean of crime, power, and ultimate betrayal, a crucial disclaimer must be laid bare. The story you are about to hear is a complex tapestry woven from countless threads. Declassified intelligence reports, decades of trial transcripts, the meticulous work of investigative journalists, and the often contradictory testimonies of pentiti, the turned mafiosi who broke their oath of silence. Our mission here is singular and clear: to collate this vast, scattered information and present to you the most coherent, factual, and comprehensive narrative possible. This is an educational journey into the mechanics of power, the allure of absolute wealth, and the inevitable price it extracts. We do not seek to glorify the criminal, but to understand the crime, to see it not as a series of brutal acts, but as a sophisticated shadow corporation that operated for decades with terrifying efficiency. So, if you are ready to embark on this journey into the heart of the Camorra's most audacious empire, I invite you to settle in, switch off the lights, and listen. If you find value in this deep dive into hidden histories, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel, as it fuels our ability to bring these meticulously researched stories to light. Now, let us travel back in time to a world emerging from the ashes of global conflict to the sun-baked, chaotic, and desperate streets of post-war Naples, where our story begins, not with a bang, but with the quiet, desperate struggle for survival that would forge a criminal prodigy. The year is 1945, and the city is a shell, pockmarked by bomb craters, teeming with a population living on the edge of despair. Into this landscape of ruin, on May 18th, Michele Zaza is born. His Naples is the kingdom of the Camorra, but not the sophisticated, corporate-like entity he would later build. This was the old guard, the Camorra of the Bassi, the grimy ground floor slums of extorting the local fruit vendor, of controlling the black market in American cigarettes and stolen military supplies. It was a world where respect was demanded at the point of a knife, and loyalty was as fragile as a loaf of bread. Young Michele grew up in this ecosystem, a keen observer of its brutal rhythms. He was not a hulking enforcer. His power would never lie in his physical strength. Instead, he possessed a different kind of weapon, a sharp, calculating mind, an innate understanding of numbers, and a vision that saw beyond the narrow, neighborhood-based rivalries that consumed his contemporaries. He saw the Camorra not as a local gang, but as a potential multinational enterprise. His first forays into the underworld were modest, almost quaint by later standards. He began as a contrabandier, a smuggler. But while others were content to sneak a few cartons of foreign cigarettes past the customs officers, Zaza saw the entire system. He understood that the real money wasn't in the product itself, but in the logistics, in the supply chain, in the art of moving vast quantities of goods across borders with the efficiency of a legitimate corporation. He started with cigarettes, the currency of the post-war European black market. He built networks, cultivated contacts in ports from Naples to Marseille, and learned every trick to bypass the authorities. This was his university, and he was graduating with top honors. It was during this time that he earned his nickname, the Shark. Some say it was for his ruthlessness in dealing with competitors. Others claim it was for his relentless, circling nature in business, his ability to sense weakness and capitalize on it with lightning speed. But the true genesis of the legend of Michele Zaza, the transformation from a local smuggler to the undisputed king of European contraband, began with a fateful, strategic alliance that would send shockwaves through the entire structure of Italian organized crime. He was about to bridge a historic divide, to form a partnership that was once thought impossible. He was going to reach out to the Sicilians. This outreach to the Sicilians was not merely a business expansion. It was a geopolitical masterstroke that redefined the balance of power in the Italian underworld. For centuries, a deep-seated, almost tribal rivalry had existed between the Neapolitan Camorra and the Sicilian Cosa Nostra. They were separate entities with different rituals, different structures, and a mutual distrust that ran as deep as the Mediterranean Sea that separated their islands. To suggest collaboration was heresy. But Michele Zaza was no heretic. He was a pragmatist of the highest order. He understood that the Camorra, for all its local strength in Naples, was like a powerful speedboat, agile and fast, but limited in its range. The Cosa Nostra, however, was an aircraft carrier, slower, more bureaucratic, but with immense, long-range power and global connections, particularly their deep and lucrative ties to the American Mafia families. Zaza's genius lay in recognizing that these two criminal superpowers were not inevitable enemies, but potential partners in a vast, symbiotic enterprise. He saw that the Camorra's expertise in complex smuggling logistics through the chaotic ports of Campania could be perfectly married to the Cosa Nostra's established distribution networks and its immense financial capital. The man who became the architect of this unprecedented alliance was the legendary Sicilian boss, Gaetano Badalamenti, a figure of immense stature and a key player in the so-called Pizza Connection case that would later stun American authorities. It was a meeting of two different criminal mindsets. Badalamenti, the traditional, powerful capo from the sun-baked hills of Sicily, and Zaza, the young, ambitious, and innovative visionary from the urban jungle of Naples. The partnership was forged not on sentiment, but on cold, hard cash. Together, they systematized the cigarette smuggling trade on an industrial scale. Zaza's organization in Naples became the primary European hub. He coordinated the purchase of millions of cigarettes from manufacturers in the Balkans and the Middle East, arranged for their shipment on a flotilla of freighters and smaller, faster boats, and masterminded their landing on the deserted coasts of Italy and France under the cover of darkness. The Cosa Nostra, through Badalamenti's networks, then handled the warehousing, the overland transport, and the distribution to a vast, insatiable black market network that stretched across the continent. The profits were astronomical, beyond the dreams of avarice. It was a river of tax-free money that flowed into the coffers of both organizations, financing their other, more violent enterprises and corrupting politicians, police, and customs officials at an unprecedented level. Zaza was no longer a smuggler. He was the CEO of a multinational, illicit corporation. He cultivated an image of a respectable, successful businessman. He moved his family to a luxurious villa in the plush Posillipo neighborhood of Naples, overlooking the very sea that served as his highway for contraband. He drove expensive cars, wore impeccably tailored suits, and frequented the most exclusive nightclubs and restaurants. This public persona of a prosperous entrepreneur was a carefully constructed shield, a form of social camouflage that allowed him to operate in plain sight. He was a master of duality the charming, generous benefactor to his local community, donating to churches and helping the poor, while simultaneously presiding over a ruthless criminal empire where any threat to the business was met with swift and terminal violence. Disloyalty was not tolerated. Mistakes were not forgiven. The same logistical networks that moved cigarettes with such flawless efficiency could also be used to traffic in far more sinister commodities, vast quantities of weapons, and eventually, the scourge that would eclipse all other criminal enterprises in its profitability and sheer destructive power. Heroin. The European heroin market of the 1970s was beginning to explode, and the Sicilian clans, with their control over refining labs and the infamous French connection pipeline, were poised to dominate it. Zaza, ever the opportunist, saw the next frontier. His existing tobacco routes were the perfect conduit for this new, deadlier cargo. He was now at the zenith of his power, a king in his own court, untouchable, it seemed, by the law. But empires built on such foundations are inherently unstable. The very scale of his success was drawing the attention of a new generation of magistrates in Italy, men who were no longer willing to turn a blind eye, and the immense, almost unimaginable wealth he was accumulating was about to attract a far more dangerous and insidious threat than any prosecutor: the envy and paranoia of his own powerful allies. This envy and paranoia festered not in the back alleys of Naples, but in the sun-baked, brutal heartland of Sicily, within the inner sanctum of the Corleonesi clan, led by the most feared and ruthless mafia boss of the 20th century, Salvatore, the Beast, Rina. Rina viewed the world through a prism of absolute dominion and saw the flourishing partnership between Zaza and Badalamenti not as a boon for Cosa Nostra, but as a dangerous anomaly, a threat to his own ambition of establishing a unified, Corleonesi-led empire that would brook no independent power centers, especially not one led by a Neapolitan. To Rina, a man steeped in the archaic and rigid codes of Sicilian honor, Zaza was an outsider, a mere businessman whose lack of traditional omerta and whose very public, flamboyant lifestyle was an affront to the secretive shadow bound nature of the true mafia. Furthermore, the river of money flowing to Zaza was, in Reina's eyes, money that was being siphoned away from the Corleonese's direct control. The situation was a tinderbox, and the spark that would ignite the Second Mafia War, a conflict of unimaginable brutality that would litter Sicily with corpses, was the audacious assassination of a powerful Palermo boss. In this escalating war, Zaza found himself in an impossible position. His ally, Badalamenti, was on the opposite side from Rina. Zaza's vast financial resources were now a coveted prize for both factions. He was no longer just a business partner. He was a strategic asset, and Reina's Corleonesi were determined to seize that asset by any means necessary. The pressure on Zaza became immense and terrifying. He was no longer navigating the predictable dangers of law enforcement. He was now trapped in the crossfire of a savage civil war within an organization known for its extreme violence and treachery. The Corleonesi began to make their demands known, and they were not requests, they were edicts, backed by the implicit threat of annihilation. Zaza, the pragmatic businessman, understood the new calculus of power. Survival meant capitulation. He was forced to sever his long-standing and profitable ties with Badalamenti and effectively become a financial tributary to Rina's murderous regime. A significant portion of the profits from his smuggling empire now had to be funneled directly to the Corleonesi, financing their war chest and their campaign of terror that would culminate in the assassinations of countless rival mafiosi, police officers, and the brave magistrates who dared to oppose them, most notably Giovanni Falcon and Paolo Borsellino. This subjugation was a humiliating and financially draining blow to Zaza's autonomy, but it was a necessary price for survival. It was during this period of forced alliance with the Corleonesi that Zaza's empire diversified and deepened its involvement in the global narcotics trade. The heroin pipelines from the Middle East and Asia, refined in Sicilian labs, now flowed with even greater volume through his established maritime routes, flooding European and American cities with poison. The profits, even after the Corleonese's cut, were so vast they became difficult to launder. Zaza invested in legitimate businesses, real estate, construction companies, restaurants, and even a popular chain of ice cream parlors. But the sheer scale of the cash was a problem. This led him to one of his most daring and controversial ventures, an enterprise that would bring him into direct contact with the highest levels of international finance and politics, and would later form the core of the scandal that would rock Italy to its foundations. His deep involvement with the Propaganda Due, or P2 Masonic Lodge. This was not a traditional criminal fraternity, but a shadow state within a state, a secret network of powerful industrialists, military leaders, intelligence officers, and politicians, all dedicated to a vague but alarming agenda of preventing a communist takeover in Italy by any means necessary. For the men of P2, Zaza's boundless, untraceable cash was a potential funding source for their clandestine operations, and for Zaza, membership in this elite club offered the ultimate protection, a shield of impunity woven from the threads of absolute power. It was the pinnacle of his ambition. The moment the smuggler from the Bassi believed he had finally transcended his origins and joined the ranks of the true rulers of the country. But this belief was a dangerous illusion, for the same connections that promised him protection were also weaving the net that would eventually untrap him. The illusion of invincibility, fortified by his connections to the shadowy P2 Lodge, began to show its first hairline fractures, not from a direct assault by the authorities, but from the inherent volatility of his criminal alliances and the relentless, patient work of a new breed of Italian magistrate, the Corleonesi. Under the psychopathic leadership of Salvatore Riina, were not reliable partners. They were predatory overlords. The financial tributes Zaza was forced to pay were immense, but for Riina, it was never enough. The Corleonesi's paranoia festered, and they began to see Zaza not as a valuable asset, but as a potential liability. A loose end who knew too much about their financial operations and their connections to the highest levels of power. Simultaneously, the Italian state, reeling from a decade of political terrorism from both the far left and right, began to suspect that a third force was manipulating events from the shadows. The 1980 assassination of the P2 Lodge's Grand Master, Licio Gelli, in a mysterious plane crash, an event many believed was an assassination, blew the lid off the secret organization, sending shockwaves through the Italian establishment as investigators scrambled to uncover the full extent of P2's membership and influence. The name Michele Zaza began to surface in intercepted communications and the confessions of turned mafiosi. He was no longer just a Camorra boss. He was a key node in a terrifying conspiracy that linked organized crime directly to the heart of the state. The first major legal blow fell in 1984, when Zaza was arrested on charges of cigarette smuggling and criminal association. It was a significant operation, the result of years of painstaking surveillance by the Guardia di Finanza, Italy's financial police, who had meticulously tracked his fleet of ships and his complex money laundering operations. But for Zaza, this was a manageable crisis. He applied the old rules of the game. He hired the best lawyers, utilized his network of corrupted contacts to slow down the judicial process, and from his cell, he continued to run his empire, issuing commands through his wife and his most trusted lieutenants. He was confident that the system, which he had so deeply penetrated, would ultimately protect him. However, he had fundamentally misjudged the changing tides. The same year he was arrested, a seismic event occurred in Palermo that would eventually doom him and every other major mafia boss. Tommaso Buscetta, a high-ranking Sicilian mafioso, decided to break the code of Omerta and become a pentito. His testimony to the pioneering magistrate Giovanni Falcone was a thunderclap, revealing the intricate structure of Cosa Nostra and its war with the Camorra over the drug trade. Buscetta spoke at length about the Neapolitan. Michele Zaza, detailing his pivotal role as the financial engine and logistical mastermind behind the transatlantic heroin trade. Buscetta's testimony provided the legal and intellectual framework for the Maxi trial in Palermo, a colossal judicial proceeding that would see hundreds of mafiosi convicted. But more importantly for Zaza, it inspired a similar revolution within the Camorra itself. The pressure was mounting, and within Zaza's own organization, the first cracks of disloyalty began to appear. The younger, more ambitious soldiers, seeing their boss imprisoned and the Corleonesi demanding ever larger shares of their profits, started to question his leadership. The old methods of intimidation were losing their power in the face of a state that was now offering powerful incentives and protection to those who would talk. The world that Zaza had built, a world where a clever man could navigate between the Camorra, Cosa Nostra, and the Italian state, was collapsing from all sides. The sharks, as they always do, were beginning to circle one of their own, sensing weakness. Yet Zaza, from his prison cell, remained defiant, convinced that his wealth and his political insurance policies would see him through. He could not see that the most dangerous witness against him was not a turncoat mafioso, but the sheer, undeniable, and mountainous evidence of his own success. The billions of lire he had funneled through his businesses, a financial trail that was now being followed by magistrates who were no longer afraid to follow it to its source, no matter how high it led. The financial trail, a sprawling, complex labyrinth of shell companies, international wire transfers, and seemingly legitimate business ventures, became the undoing of Michele Zaza's carefully constructed fortress. While he was fighting the cigarette smuggling charges in one courtroom, a separate, more formidable legal front opened against him, led by magistrates who understood that to defeat a modern criminal enterprise, you had to follow the money. This new strategy bypassed the traditional difficulties of securing eyewitness testimony and instead relied on forensic accounting, bank records, and the painstaking reconstruction of financial flows. The investigators discovered that Zaza's empire was not a single entity, but a hydra-headed monster. There were the obvious investments, the luxurious villas in Posillipo, the fleet of speedboats and cargo ships registered under Panamanian flags, the upscale restaurants in Naples and Rome that were famous for their exorbitant prices, and their clientele of politicians and celebrities. But beneath this visible layer existed a second, shadow economy. They uncovered his ownership of a popular chain of ice cream parlors, Gelati Preziosi, which with its high volume of small, cash transactions, was a perfect vehicle for laundering money. They traced his investments in construction companies that won suspiciously lucrative public works contracts, and in textile firms that reported massive exports to countries with no discernible textile market. The paper trail was a masterpiece of obfuscation, but the magistrates, armed with new anti-racketeering laws, began to connect the dots. They could see the pattern. Money generated from heroin sales in New York would be deposited in a bank in Lugano, Switzerland. From there, it would be transferred to a holding company in Liechtenstein, which would then loan the money to a construction firm in Naples owned by one of Zaza's frontmen. That firm would then report inflated profits from a government contract, and the now cleaned money would be used to purchase a legitimate asset like a commercial property in Milan. This entire process, which Zaza had perfected, was known as recycling, and for years it had made him untouchable, transforming the dirty cash of crime into the respectable wealth of a businessman. However, the magistrate's relentless focus on this financial ecosystem began to cause irreparable damage. They started seizing his assets, his villas, his boats, his businesses. This was a tactical blow far more devastating than any prison sentence. A boss could run his empire from a cell, but he could not do so without the financial infrastructure to pay his soldiers, bribe officials, and finance his legal defense. The seizure of assets crippled his organization's operational capacity and, more importantly, shattered the aura of invincibility that was essential to maintaining control within the Camorra. Power is a perception, and the perception was now that Zaza was a sinking ship. This internal decay was accelerated by the increasingly aggressive efforts of the Corleonesi, who, fearing that Zaza's legal troubles would lead him to become a pentito himself, began to make contingency plans. The word in the underworld was that a contract had been issued, not just on Zaza, but on his entire inner circle, to eliminate any potential witnesses. Zaza found himself in a perfect storm, besieged by the state from the outside and betrayed by his allies from within. The final, most humiliating blow came from within the very institution he believed he had corrupted beyond repair. A young, dogged prosecutor in Naples, building on the financial evidence, managed to secure a separate indictment against him for his central role in the international narcotics trade, linking him directly to the heroin that was flooding American cities. The evidence was overwhelming, and this time, the political cover from the P2 Lodge had evaporated, its members themselves now scattered and facing prosecution. The once untouchable cash king of the Camorra was now facing multiple, consecutive life sentences, with the full force of the Italian state finally unleashed, bearing down upon him. The walls were not just closing in, they had collapsed, and he was buried in the rubble of his own empire. A king without a kingdom, a shark trapped in a net of his own weaving. The final act of Michele Zaza's dramatic life was a protracted, grim spectacle played out in courtrooms and prison hospitals, a stark contrast to the glittering, high-flying existence he had known for 2 decades. Convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for a litany of crimes including murder, drug trafficking, and criminal association, Zaza was transferred to the harsh, maximum security prison of Poggioreale in Naples, a place he had once ruled from the outside. The king was now a captive in his own former kingdom, a symbolic fall that was not lost on the Neapolitan underworld. Yet, even from within the grim confines of his cell, he attempted to wield power, his mind still sharp, issuing commands through his few remaining loyalists and his wife, who fought a desperate rearguard action to prevent the state from seizing every last asset of their immense fortune. But the world had irrevocably changed. The Camorra had evolved, splintering into ferocious, new factions that were far more violent and less bound by the old codes of conduct. These new clans, with names like the Licciardi and the Contini, were not interested in the sophisticated smuggling empires of the past. Their currency was cocaine, extortion, and ruthless territorial control, and they saw the old guard, embodied by Zaza, as relics to be discarded. His name, once spoken with a mixture of fear and respect, was now merely a footnote in their brutal ascent. Furthermore, his health, both physical and mental, began a steep and irreversible decline. The stress of his legal battles, the constant fear of assassination from both the Corleonesi and his Camorra rivals, and the crushing reality of a life behind bars took a severe toll. He was diagnosed with a serious heart condition, a weakness that in his world was as much a liability as a confession to the authorities. He was moved from Poggioriale to the prison ward of a public hospital, a place scarcely more comfortable, but where he could receive the medical attention he now desperately needed. It was here, in a sterile, anonymous room, surrounded by the guards of the state he had so flagrantly defied, that the once mighty shark spent his final days. The man who had dined with politicians, who had influenced national events, and who had controlled a financial empire spanning continents, was now reduced to a frail patient. His world shrunk to the four walls of a hospital room, his only view that of a concrete courtyard. On June 17, 1994, Michele Zaza's heart gave out. He was 49 years old. His death was as shrouded in controversy as his life. Officially, the cause was a cardiac arrest, a natural consequence of his long-standing condition. But in the alleys of Naples and the corridors of power in Rome, other, more sinister theories immediately took root. Many believed he had been silenced, that a slow, acting poison had been administered to him to ensure he would never have the chance to follow in the footsteps of Basetta and become a pentito, revealing secrets that could implicate people in positions of even greater power. Others saw it as the simple, inevitable burnout of a man who had lived a dozen lifetimes of stress and danger in one. There was no grand funeral, no procession of powerful mourners. The Camorra, in its new, raw form, had already moved on. His death was not an epoch-ending event. It was merely the closing of a chapter. The empire he built, the cigarette smuggling network, did not die with him. It was simply absorbed, fractured, and repurposed by the next generation of criminals. The methods he perfected, the financial slate of hand, and the corrupting of institutions became the standard curriculum for the global underworld. Michele Zaza was a pioneer, a criminal innovator whose legacy is not a monument, but a blueprint. He demonstrated that organized crime could operate not just as a gang, but as a multinational corporation, and in doing so, he paved the way for the even more fluid and dangerous criminal enterprises of the 21st century. His story is a dark parable about the intoxicating nature of power and its ultimate fragility, a reminder that no empire, especially one built on a foundation of violence and fear, can ever truly be eternal. And so, the story of Michele Zaza, the Camorra's cash king, reaches its somber conclusion, not with a dramatic shootout or a triumphant arrest, but with the quiet, lonely death of a man whose ambitions had once seemed limitless. His legacy, however, did not perish in that hospital room, It seeped into the very fabric of global organized crime, evolving and adapting, becoming more elusive and more dangerous than ever before. The sophisticated corporate model he pioneered, the seamless merging of illicit commerce with legitimate business, the sophisticated international logistics, and the strategic corruption of financial and political institutions became the new gold standard for criminal enterprises worldwide. The narco cartels of Latin America, the cyber criminal syndicates of Eastern Europe, and the trafficking networks of Southeast Asia all operate on principles that Zaza helped to refine and perfect. He was a visionary in the darkest sense of the word, demonstrating that the greatest power lies not in the barrel of a gun, but in the control of capital and the manipulation of systems. His life serves as a stark and enduring lesson, a case study in the corrupting allure of absolute power and the inevitable self-destructive consequences of a life lived outside the boundaries of law and morality. It reminds us that the battle against organized crime is not merely a matter of law enforcement. It is a continuous struggle for the integrity of our financial systems, the transparency of our political institutions, and the very soul of our societies. The shadows in which Zaza operated still exist, and they are populated by new generations of ambitious individuals who have studied his successes and learned from his failures. His story is not a closed book from a bygone era. It is a warning from history, a mirror held up to the enduring challenges we face. If you found this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of power and crime compelling, if it has shed light on a complex and often misunderstood chapter of recent history, then we invite you to become a part of our community of curious minds. Please show your support by liking this video, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing to this channel. By subscribing, you ensure that you will not miss our future explorations into the untold stories, the hidden figures, and the secret histories that have shaped our world. We dedicate countless hours to research, synthesis, and narration to bring you these comprehensive narratives, and your engagement is what makes this journey possible. Thank you for listening, for venturing into the shadows with us, and for seeking to understand the complex forces that move our world. The story of Michele Zaza is over, but the search for understanding continues. To truly grasp the scale of Michele Zaza's criminal innovation, one must look beyond the man and examine the intricate machine he built, a corporate entity that functioned with a chilling efficiency that rivaled any legitimate multinational of its time. The core of this empire was its sophisticated, multi-layered logistical framework for cigarette smuggling, an operation so vast it required its own dedicated departments, each with specialized roles and a clear chain of command, mirroring the structure of a large corporation. At the top sat Zaza, the chief executive officer, the strategic mind who oversaw the entire operation and managed the critical, high-level relationships with the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and, later, the Corleonesi. Below him was a tier of trusted lieutenants, his vice presidents, each responsible for a specific geographic zone or a critical function. One lieutenant would manage the procurement, Division, liaising directly with tobacco manufacturers in state-run factories across Eastern Europe, particularly in Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, where officials were easily corrupted with hard currency. Another would oversee the maritime transport division, commanding a private fleet that ranged from large, ocean-going freighters that would wait in international waters to a swarm of smaller, faster blitz boats, specially modified for speed and stealth, capable of darting into secluded coves along the Italian and French coasts to unload their illicit cargo under cover of darkness. A third lieutenant ran the land distribution network, a continent spanning web of warehouses and trucking routes that moved the millions of cigarettes from the drop points to wholesalers and street vendors across Europe. This entire operation was shielded by a security and corruption division, whose sole purpose was to manage the vast network of corrupted officials, customs agents, port authorities, police officers, and politicians, who were paid substantial monthly retainers, effectively put on the Zaza organization's payroll to ensure that ships were not inspected, trucks were not stopped, and investigations were mysteriously stalled or misdirected. The financial flows were handled with equal precision, managed by a shadow finance department that included accountants and lawyers who established a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore bank accounts, primarily in Switzerland and Liechtenstein, to launder the hundreds of billions of lire in profits. This money would then be reinvested into the legitimate economy, buying restaurants, construction firms, and real estate, not just to clean the cash, but to gain social standing and political influence. This was not a chaotic gang of thugs, it was a highly disciplined, vertically integrated corporation whose product happened to be illegal. Zaza's genius was in recognizing that the principles of business management, specialization, delegation, supply chain optimization, and strategic reinvestment could be applied to criminal enterprise with devastating effect. He created a model that was resilient, scalable, and immensely profitable. A model that would outlive him and become the template for the global drug trafficking organizations that dominate the criminal landscape today. His empire was a dark testament to the fact that the most dangerous criminal is not necessarily the most violent, but the most organized, the one who understands that in the modern world, the most powerful weapon is not a pistol, but a flawless business plan and a well-placed bribe. The transition of Zaza's empire from tobacco to narcotics, particularly heroin, was not a shift in business, but a logical and terrifying expansion of his existing, flawless logistical framework. The same secret sea lanes that transported millions of cigarettes could, with trivial adjustment, transport hundreds of kilos of morphine, base from the Middle East to the refining labs in Sicily. The same corrupted port officials who looked the other way for contraband tobacco required no additional persuasion to ignore the more sinister cargo. The same network of land-based trucks and warehouses that distributed cigarettes across Europe became the perfect distribution system for cellophane, wrapped bricks of high purity heroin destined for the streets of New York, Paris, and Rome. This pivot was driven by simple, brutal economics. The profit margin on heroin was exponentially higher than on cigarettes, where a shipment of contraband tobacco could net a few 100 million lire. A similar sized shipment of heroin could generate profits in the billions. For a businessman like Zaza, the calculation was inevitable. His role in the so-called pizza connection case, where Sicilian mafiosi used pizzerias in the United States as fronts for heroin distribution, was foundational. He became one of the primary suppliers, the man who ensured the product moved from the source to the refiners to the distributors. This deepened his alliance with the Corleonesi, who controlled the refining capacity, but it also exponentially increased the stakes. The violence associated with the drug trade was of a different order of magnitude than the occasional skirmishes of the cigarette black market. This was a world of brutal territorial disputes, of addicts and dealers eliminated as loose ends, and of the constant, paranoid threat of betrayal. Zaza, ever the corporate manager, attempted to insulate himself from this raw violence by maintaining a layer of operational separation. He was the financier and the logistician, not the street-level enforcer. But this insulation was porous. The sheer volume of money flowing from heroin attracted the relentless attention of American law enforcement agencies, particularly the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, who began to work closely with their Italian counterparts. The international scope of the investigation meant that Zaza's operations were now under a global microscope. His phone lines, both in his Naples villas and on his boats, were tapped. His movements were tracked by satellites. His financial transactions, once hidden in the complexity of his own system, were now being unraveled by a joint task force with nearly unlimited resources. The pressure was immense and unrelenting. Furthermore, the nature of his business partners ensured that the threat was not only external. The Corleonesi, under Rina, were notoriously treacherous. A business disagreement, a perceived slight, or simply the paranoid fear that Zaza knew too much could result in a death sentence from which not even his wealth and influence could save him. He was now walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss, with the forces of the law on one side and the homicidal tendencies of his allies on the other. The elegant corporate structure he had built was now being used to traffic a product that brought with it a level of scrutiny and violence that the tobacco trade never could. The very efficiency of his machine that had made him a king was now making him a prime target for the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world, and the clock was ticking down towards his inevitable confrontation with a justice system that was no longer willing to be bought or intimidated. The immense, almost unimaginable wealth generated by this narcotics-fueled expansion created a problem of a different kind for Michele Zaza. The monumental challenge of laundering and legitimizing profits, so vast they threatened to drown his own organization. The sheer physical volume of cash, literally rooms filled with banknotes of small denominations, was a logistical nightmare. Counting, storing, and moving this cash required its own dedicated infrastructure, a shadow banking system entirely controlled by the clan. They employed teams of money counters who worked around the clock, bundling and boxing the money for its journey into the legitimate economy. The primary method for this was a sophisticated process known as il riciclaggio, the recycling. It began with the placement stage, where the bulky cash was systematically deposited into hundreds of bank accounts across Italy and Switzerland, often in amounts just below the reporting thresholds. A tedious process carried out by a small army of low-level associates known as cassieri. Once the money was in the banking system, the layering stage began. This involved a dizzying series of international wire transfers between a complex web of shell companies, often little more than a name on a piece of paper in a Panama or Liechtenstein lawyer's office. Money would be transferred from a company in Naples to one in Zurich, then to another in Luxembourg, then to a final holding company in the Bahamas. Each transaction was designed to create a labyrinthine paper trail so complex that it would be nearly impossible for any financial investigator to follow. The final stage was integration. Here, the now clean money, appearing as a legitimate business loan or investment profit, was used to purchase visible, income-generating assets. Zaza invested heavily in the burgeoning tourist industry on the Amalfi Coast, buying up hotels and restaurants. He purchased construction firms that miraculously began winning public works contracts, their bids often underpinned by a combination of his illicit capital and the intimidation of competitors. He bought vast tracts of agricultural land and modernized wine production. One of his most famous and brazen ventures was the Gelati Preziosi ice cream parlor chain, with its high volume of small, cash-based transactions. It was a perfect vehicle for mixing dirty money with clean profits. A single shop could theoretically claim to sell thousands of euros worth of ice cream a day, providing a plausible explanation for the constant influx of cash. This entire financial architecture was managed by a team of complicit accountants, lawyers, and bankers who provided a veneer of respectability to the operation. They were the essential gears in the machine. The technocrats of crime who understood international finance law better than most prosecutors. For Zaza, this was not just about hiding wealth. It was about achieving a form of social redemption. He craved the status of a legitimate tycoon. He wanted to be seen as a job creator, a benefactor to his community, a respected member of the bourgeoisie. This desire for legitimacy was his Achilles heel. Every asset he purchased, every business he registered, created a paper trail, while the individual transactions were designed to be opaque. The overall pattern of his wealth accumulation was not. When magistrates finally began to connect the dots, they saw a man with no formal education or documented legitimate inheritance suddenly amassing a fortune that rivaled that of old industrial families. The very things he bought to cement his legitimacy, the hotels, the construction firms, the ice cream parlors, became the evidence used to dismantle his empire. The king of contraband had built a fortress of money, but the foundations were made of sand, vulnerable to the relentless tide of forensic accounting, and a state that had finally decided to follow the money to its source. This relentless pursuit by the state, armed with new legal weapons and an unshakable determination, began to systematically dismantle Zaza's empire piece by piece, asset by asset. The strategy was no longer just to imprison the man, but to annihilate the entire financial ecosystem that gave him power and sustained his organization. Specialized anti-mafia directorates, established in the wake of the assassinations of Falcone and Borsellino, were granted sweeping powers to seize and confiscate property based on evidence that it was the product of illicit activities, even while trials were still ongoing. This was a game changer. Zaza could sit in his cell, confident his lawyers could delay a final verdict for years, but he was powerless to stop the state from physically taking his villas, his ships, his businesses, and his bank accounts. One by one, the symbols of his wealth were stripped from him. The luxurious villa in Posillipo, with its panoramic view of the Bay of Naples, once the scene of lavish parties attended by politicians and socialites, was sealed shut, its contents inventoried, and its gates chained. The fleet of speedboats and cargo ships, the workhorses of his smuggling empire, were impounded in port, their registrations revoked, slowly rusting into obscurity. His investments in the tourism sector were taken over by court-appointed administrators, the gelati preziosi, ice cream parlors, once a brilliant tool for money laundering, were now a public monument to his downfall, their ownership transferred to the state. This asset stripping had a catastrophic domino effect within his criminal organization. The soldiers and lieutenants who had remained loyal, or at least compliant, were motivated by a steady flow of cash. With the financial spigot turned off, that loyalty evaporated. The intricate web of corruption that had protected him for so long began to unravel as well. Customs officials and police officers on his payroll, seeing the direction of the wind, stopped taking his money, fearing they would be caught in the dragnet and lose their pensions and their freedom. The political cover that the P2 Lodge might have once provided had completely vanished, its members themselves disgraced and facing prosecution. Zaza was becoming isolated, a general whose army was deserting and whose treasury was empty. From his prison cell, he could only watch as the empire he had spent a lifetime building was methodically taken apart by the very institutions he believed he had conquered. This financial siege was more effective than any prison sentence. It demonstrated a profound understanding of modern organized crime, that its lifeblood is not fear, but money. Without the astronomical profits from smuggling and narcotics, the Zaza clan could no longer pay its members, bribe officials, finance legal defenses, or maintain its social influence through patronage. The organization began to fracture from within, splintering into smaller, more desperate factions that turned on each other in a violent struggle for the scraps of the former empire. The mighty corporation was being liquidated by the state, and its CEO was trapped in a cell, powerless to stop the receivers from selling off the pieces. A king watching his kingdom be parceled out and sold at auction. His legacy not one of enduring power, but of a spectacular and total collapse. The internal fracture of the Zaza clan was not a quiet, administrative dissolution. It was a violent, chaotic implosion that mirrored the brutal power struggles happening within Cosa Nostra, but with the distinctive, anarchic ferocity of the Camorra, the younger generation of Camorristi, who had grown up in the shadow of Zaza's wealth, but lacked his strategic vision and business acumen, saw his imprisonment and financial ruin not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. They were products of a harsher, more nihilistic era, weaned on the instant riches of cocaine and the raw power of the Kalashnikov. To them, Zaza's methods, the complex international alliances, the patient cultivation of political contacts, the sophisticated money laundering, seemed slow, outdated, and unnecessarily complicated. They craved direct control and immediate, explosive profit. This generational schism turned the streets of Naples into a battlefield. The old guard, still loyal to Zaza or to his model of criminal enterprise, found themselves under attack from these new, ambitious clans like the Licciardi and the Contini, who launched a relentless campaign of intimidation and assassination to seize control of the drug piazzas, the street level dealing spots that had once been part of Zaza's distribution network. The violence was not contained to back alleys. It erupted in broad daylight, in crowded piazzas, outside schools, a terrifying demonstration of the new clan's brazen disregard for civilian life and public order. Car bombs, once a signature of the Sicilian Mafia, became a tool in Naples. Ambushes with military-grade weaponry became commonplace. This internal war was as damaging to the Zaza clan as any state prosecution. Trust evaporated completely. Lieutenants who had worked together for decades now viewed each other with suspicion, unsure of who had switched allegiance to the rising powers. The discipline that had been the hallmark of Zaza's corporate style operation was replaced by paranoia and treachery. This internal chaos provided the state with its most powerful weapon, pentiti. With the organization crumbling and the promise of wealth and power gone, the incentives to talk began to outweigh the threats of the Code of Omert. Lower-level soldiers, facing long prison sentences and fearing for their lives in the internal war, saw collaboration with the authorities as their only path to survival. They began to provide prosecutors with detailed accounts of the clan's operations, its hidden arsenals, its remaining corruption networks, and, most damningly, its past murders. This flood of confessions from within his own organization sealed Zaza's fate more conclusively than any financial audit ever could. The testimonies painted a comprehensive picture of his leadership, directly linking him to ordering specific acts of violence to protect his business interests. Evidence that was crucial for securing the murder convictions that would keep him in prison for life. The king was not just dethroned, his own court had turned against him, providing the final, irrefutable testimony that would ensure his crown would never be restored, and that his name would become synonymous not with invincible power, but with a failed dynasty, its legacy one of blood and betrayal. The psychological toll on Michele Zaza during this period of catastrophic collapse was immense and ultimately fatal. A slow, motion unraveling of a mind that had been conditioned to believe in its own invincibility. Confined to a prison cell, then a hospital ward, he was a captive audience to the destruction of his life's work, receiving fragmented reports of his assets being seized, his allies being killed or turning state's witness, and his family name being dragged through the mud of countless court proceedings. The man who had once moved international markets and commanded the respect of the most powerful criminals in Europe was now reduced to the petty routines of institutional life, his every movement monitored, his communications controlled. This loss of agency, for a control freak of his magnitude, was a form of psychological torture far more refined than any physical hardship. He was known to be a proud man, and the public spectacle of his downfall. The newspaper headlines detailing his financial ruin, the televised reports of his confiscated villas filled with priceless art and gold, was a deep and personal humiliation. The very flamboyance that had once been his shield, a declaration of his untouchable status, was now the primary evidence of his crimes. He could see his own reflection in the media's portrayal of him, no longer as a shrewd businessman, but as a common, albeit spectacularly successful, gangster. This cognitive dissonance, the chasm between his self-image and his new reality, must have been unbearable. Furthermore, the constant, knowing fear of assassination, a threat that had always been present, but was now amplified by his vulnerability in state custody, eroded his sanity. The Corleonesi, who had never trusted him, saw his imprisonment as a permanent liability. A life sentence was not a guarantee of silence, only death was. The possibility of a poisoned meal, a suicide orchestrated by a corrupted guard, or a sudden, fatal illness was a real and present danger that shadowed his every waking moment. This paranoia, combined with the genuine and deteriorating condition of his heart, created a feedback loop of decline. The stress exacerbated his cardiac issues, and his failing health, in turn, increased his anxiety and sense of helplessness. The strong, charismatic figure began to wither into a frail, anxious patient, his body mirroring the state of his empire. His world, which had once spanned continents, had shrunk to the four walls of a hospital room, his only connection to the outside world being the grim news brought by his lawyers, or the occasional, heavily supervised family visit. In these final days, he was forced to confront the true cost of his ambition. The vast fortune was gone, the power had evaporated, the legacy he had perhaps hoped for, that of a modern-day Robin Hood or a respected benefactor, was in ashes, replaced by the indelible stain of a drug trafficker and murderer. The story of Michele Zaza becomes, in its final chapter, a profound human tragedy, a lesson in the emptiness that can lie at the heart of immense material success when it is built on a foundation of corruption and violence. He died as he had lived at the center of a storm, but this time it was a silent, internal storm of regret, fear, and the crushing weight of a final, absolute defeat. A lonely end for a man who had always surrounded himself with people, but who ultimately died completely alone. The immediate aftermath of Michele Zaza's death in 1994 was not a period of mourning in the underworld, but a frenzied and violent power grab that solidified the ascendancy of the new, more brutal model of Camorra he had inadvertently helped to create. The vast territory and criminal markets he once controlled did not lie fallow. They were instantly carved up by the emerging clans, who fought a series of bloody wars throughout the 1990s that made the violence of Zaza's era seem almost gentlemanly in comparison. The Licciardi, Contini, and Sarno clans, among others, engaged in a terrifying struggle for control of Naples' drug distribution piazzas, a conflict characterized by a level of brutality that shocked even a city long inured to Camorra violence. These new clans had no interest in Zaza's corporate legacy. They were focused on the retail end of the drug trade, on extortion, and on public contracts, but they operated with a short-term, predatory ethos that valued immediate cash flow over long-term stability and strategic alliances. The concept of a unified, corporate Camorra died with Zaza, replaced by a fragmented, hyper-competitive landscape of warring factions. This fragmentation, however, did not mean the Camorra became weaker. In many ways, it became more resilient and more difficult to combat. A single, hierarchical organization like Zaza's presented a clear target for investigators. A decentralized network of dozens of independent, constantly feuding clans was a hydra, whose heads would regenerate faster than the state could cut them off. The Italian state's victory over Zaza was, therefore, a Pyrrhic one. They had decapitated a king, but in doing so, they had unleashed a hydra. The confiscation of his assets, while symbolically powerful, did little to stem the tide of criminality in Campania. It simply transferred economic power to these new, more volatile entities. The methods of money laundering evolved, becoming less about long-term investments in legitimate businesses and more about rapid, complex cryptocurrency transactions and international trade-based money laundering that was even harder to trace. The political corruption also mutated. Instead of cultivating high-level contacts in Rome, the new clans focused on corrupting local municipal governments, controlling the awarding of public works contracts for waste management and construction, leading to the infamous garbage crisis in Naples and the construction of shoddy, unsafe buildings that became tragic symbols of the Camorra's enduring stranglehold on the region's economy. The story of Michele Zaza, therefore, does not end with his death. It merely enters a new, more chaotic, and in some ways more destructive phase. His life and downfall represent the end of an era, the closing of a chapter on a certain type of criminal entrepreneur who saw himself as a businessman first and a gangster second. The Camorristi who followed him were gangsters first, last, and always, with a nihilistic disregard for the very concept of legitimacy that Zaza had so desperately craved. His legacy is a paradox. He was both the peak of a certain criminal sophistication and the cause of its extinction, his failure paving the way for a darker, more anarchic, and ultimately more tenacious criminal reality that continues to plague the region to this day, proving that the defeat of a single man, no matter how powerful, is never the defeat of the system he represented. To fully comprehend the enduring legacy of Michele Zaza, one must look beyond the immediate chaos of the Camorra's internal wars and examine the profound, lasting impact his criminal model had on the global underworld, an influence that extends far beyond the sun-baked streets of Naples and into the boardrooms of shadowy enterprises operating in every corner of the world. Zaza was a pioneer, a criminal innovator who successfully demonstrated that the principles of multinational corporate management could be applied to illicit activities with staggering profitability. His approach to smuggling, treating it as a matter of supply chain logistics, market analysis, and risk management, became the foundational textbook for the global drug cartels that would rise to prominence in the decades following his death. The Mexican and Colombian cartels, for instance, did not merely replicate his methods, they perfected them, building on his blueprint of using sophisticated transport networks, corrupting entire government institutions, and laundering money through vast webs of front companies. Furthermore, Zaza's strategic alliance with the Sicilian Cosa Nostra broke a centuries-old paradigm of regional isolationism within Italian organized crime. He proved that collaboration between historically rival syndicates was not only possible, but could be exponentially more profitable than conflict, a lesson that was not lost on criminal groups worldwide. Today, we see these transnational alliances regularly, with South American cartels partnering with European mafias to distribute cocaine, and cybercriminals from Eastern Europe, laundering their proceeds through networks established by Asian trafficking rings. Zaza was among the first to think globally, to see national borders not as obstacles, but as opportunities for arbitrage, exploiting the differences in law enforcement capabilities and legal frameworks between countries. His foray into high-level political corruption through the P2 Lodge also set a dangerous precedent, illustrating that the ultimate protection for a criminal empire lay not in the fear it instilled in the populace, but in the influence it wielded over the levers of state power. This lesson has been internalized by every major criminal organization of the 21st century, which now invest heavily in corrupting politicians, judges, and law enforcement not just locally, but at the national and international level. The very structure of modern organized crime, decentralized, networked, financially sophisticated, and deeply embedded in the legitimate economy, bears the unmistakable imprint of Michele Zaza's vision. He was the bridge between the old world of the neighborhood gangster and the new world of the global criminal CEO. His story is therefore not a relic of the past, but a crucial origin story for the present, a key to understanding how crime evolved from a local nuisance into a transnational, existential threat to the stability of nations and the integrity of the global financial system. His rise and fall offer a timeless lesson about the nature of power and the inherent vulnerabilities of a system that can be bought. But his methods live on, refined and scaled by a new generation of criminals who operate in the vast, dark spaces of the globalized world he helped to create. The personal life of Michele Zaza, existing in the stark contrast between his ruthless public persona and his role as a family man provides a fascinating and deeply human lens through which to view his entire saga, revealing the profound contradictions that defined him. To the outside world, he was the Shark, a moniker that evoked cold-blooded predation and relentless ambition. Within the walls of his villas, particularly the one in the exclusive Posillipo neighborhood, he was a devoted husband to his wife, Rosaria, and a doting father to his children. He fiercely compartmentalized these two worlds, striving to build a bubble of normalcy and privilege for his family, insulating them from the violence and treachery that was the daily currency of his professional life. He wanted for his children the very things his criminal success could ironically never truly provide: legitimacy, safety, and a future untainted by his own notoriety. He enrolled them in the best schools, surrounded them with luxury, and attempted to project the image of a successful, self-made businessman. Yet, this carefully constructed domestic idol was perpetually under threat, a fortress besieged by the consequences of his actions. The constant presence of armed bodyguards, the whispered conversations that would stop when his children entered the room, the underlying tension that came with the knowledge that any day could bring a rival's bullet or a police raid. These were the inescapable realities of their lives. For Rosaria, her husband's empire was a gilded cage. She was the lady of the manor, adorned with jewels and fine clothes, but she was also a key operative in his organization, especially after his imprisonment. She became a crucial conduit, relaying his messages, managing his remaining finances, and attempting to hold the disintegrating clan together, all while navigating the same threats that had consumed her husband. The psychological burden on the family was immense. They lived with the knowledge that their wealth, their status, and their very safety were built on a foundation of murder, addiction, and corruption. The love and protection Zaza offered them was genuine, but it was also the very source of their peril. When the state began its massive confiscation of assets, the family was not spared. The villas, the cars, the bank accounts, everything they had known was stripped away, a public humiliation that extended to his wife and children. The name Zaza, once a symbol of power in Naples, became a mark of Cain, a brand of criminality that his children would have to carry for the rest of their lives. In the end, Zaza's ultimate failure was not just professional, it was personal. The dynasty he hoped to build crumbled to dust. The fortune he amassed to secure his family's future was seized by the state. The legacy he left them was not one of honor and respect, but of infamy and shame. His story becomes a tragic parable about the limits of criminal wealth, demonstrating that no amount of money can buy a clean conscience or a truly secure future for those you love. The gilded cage was eventually broken open, not by a rival gangster, but by the slow, grinding wheels of justice, leaving his family exposed to the world, their lives a public testament to the hollow victory of a man who won every battle except the one for his own soul and the future of his bloodline. The judicial aftermath of Michele Zaza's life stretched far beyond his death, a long, complex legal epilogue that saw the Italian state continue its relentless campaign to dismantle every last remnant of his influence and reclaim his illicitly gained wealth for the public good. In a series of posthumous trials and ongoing civil asset forfeiture proceedings, prosecutors worked to legally solidify the connection between Zaza's convicted criminal activities and the vast network of properties and businesses he had acquired. This was a crucial philosophical and legal battle. It was the state asserting, in a court of law, that these assets were not the legitimate fruits of entrepreneurship, but the direct proceeds of murder, drug trafficking, and extortion. Each confiscated villa, each seized company, was a symbolic victory in this war of attrition against the cultural acceptance of mafia wealth. The process was monumental. The villas in Posillipo, stripped of their opulent furnishings, were repurposed. Some were transferred to municipal authorities to be used for social programs, a deliberate and powerful irony. Homes built with money from heroin addiction being converted into community centers or shelters. The fleet of ships was sold for scrap, their value recycled into state coffers. The gelati preziosi, ice cream parlors, once a brilliant money laundering scheme, were sold to legitimate owners. Their connection to the Zaza clan erased from their commercial identity. This process of social reuse of confiscated assets became a key strategy in Italy's anti-mafia efforts, a way to visibly demonstrate that the state could not only imprison mafiosi, but could also physically reclaim the territory and economic power they had stolen. For the Zaza family, these posthumous legal battles were a continuous source of anguish and stigma, a constant reminder that the patriarch's legacy was a burden they could not escape. They fought protracted legal battles to try to retain some assets, arguing they were acquired with legitimate funds or were essential for their survival. But they were largely unsuccessful. The Italian legal system, hardened by decades of conflict with organized crime, had become adept at tracing the paper trails and piercing the corporate veils that criminals like Zaza used to hide their ownership. The final, absolute legal defeat for the Zaza Empire was not a single court ruling, but the slow, administrative grinding down of his entire estate until nothing remained in the family's hands that could be credibly claimed as legitimate. This long, unglamorous work of accountants and magistrates was, in many ways, the most significant part of Zaza's story. It proved that the state possessed the stamina and the tools to pursue a criminal enterprise to its absolute end, to follow the money not just to the boss, but to his heirs and assigns. It sent an unequivocal message to the new generation of Camorristi that the wealth they accumulated, no matter how well hidden, could be taken from them and their families long after they were gone. The complete and total confiscation of Michele Zaza's fortune was the final, definitive word on his life. A judicial pronouncement that his immense power had been an illusion, his vast wealth a temporary loan from the society he had so brutally exploited, a debt that was now being called in with interest down to the very last lira. The cultural and social footprint of Michele Zaza on the city of Naples and the broader Italian consciousness is a complex and deeply contradictory legacy, a stain and a perverse source of twisted pride that reveals much about the complicated relationship between the Italian South and the power structures that have historically governed it. In the popular imagination of Naples, particularly in the quartiere where he was born, Zaza is not merely a cautionary tale. He is also a symbol, a figure who embodies a certain narrative of rebellion and self-made success against a system perceived as inherently hostile and corrupt. To the marginalized and the disenfranchised, his story could be read as an epic of a man who, starting from nothing in the post-war rubble, used his wits and sheer force of will to build an empire, to live in unimaginable luxury, and to command the fear and respect of the powerful. He was the local boy who made good, or rather, made bad on a spectacular scale, and in a context where the legitimate economy offered few avenues for social mobility, his illicit ascent held a dark, seductive appeal. He was known for being a grand signor, a great gentleman. In the old Camorra tradition, a boss who distributed money and favors in his neighborhood, who paid for weddings and funerals, who acted as a patron and a protector, creating a parallel welfare state that the Italian government had failed to provide. This created a reservoir of popular support and a culture of silence, a modern-day version of the ancient clientelism that has always characterized southern Italian society. Yet, this romanticized vision is a dangerous illusion, one that deliberately ignores the brutal reality of his reign, the addiction spread by his heroin, the lives destroyed by his violence, the corrosive culture of fear and corruption he entrenched. The Italian state, in its efforts to combat the mafia, has had to wage a war not just on the criminal organizations themselves, but on this cultural mythology, this mafioso chick that can glamorize figures like Zaza. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists have worked tirelessly to demystify the figure of the gangster, to portray the sordid reality behind the gold chains and luxury cars, to show the broken families, the moral decay, and the societal rot that is the true legacy of such men. The confiscation of his assets and their conversion to social use is a key part of this cultural battle, a tangible effort to rewrite the narrative, to demonstrate that true heroism lies not in defiant criminality, but in the quiet, courageous work of the magistrates, police officers, and citizens who stand up to it. Zaza's story, therefore, exists in two parallel dimensions, the myth and the reality. The myth is the powerful, self-made king, a story that continues to hold sway in certain pockets of society. The reality is the fragile, paranoid man who died alone in a hospital bed, his empire dissolved, his family's name shamed, his wealth reclaimed by the community he plundered. The enduring struggle in Italy is to ensure that the reality completely eclipses the myth, that the story of Michele Zaza is remembered not as a perverse inspiration, but as a definitive lesson in the ultimate emptiness and self-destruction that lies at the heart of the criminal dream, a warning that the price of such power is always paid, not just by the individual, but by the entire society that tolerates or even tacitly admires it. The geopolitical landscape of the late Cold War, a period defined by shadowy intelligence operations, political instability, and the pervasive fear of communism, provided the perfect breeding ground for a criminal entrepreneur of Michele Zaza's caliber, offering him unprecedented opportunities for protection and expansion that would have been unthinkable in a more stable political climate. Italy in the 1970s and 1980s was a nation on the brink, rocked by terrorist attacks from both the far left and the far right, a period known as the years of lead. In this atmosphere of crisis, various clandestine networks, often with links to state intelligence agencies and NATO, operated with a singular, overriding objective: to prevent the Italian Communist Party from ever coming to power by any means necessary. It was into this treacherous, subterranean world that Zaza was drawn through his involvement with the Propaganda Due, or P2 Masonic Lodge. For the powerful figures within P2, industrialists, generals, secret service chiefs, and politicians, Zaza represented a unique and invaluable asset. He possessed what they desperately needed for their the books, operations, an endless, untraceable, and deniable source of cash. His smuggling empire generated rivers of liquidity that could be used to finance black operations, fund anti-communist propaganda, bribe politicians, and arm clandestine paramilitary groups, all without any official parliamentary oversight or paper trail leading back to the Italian state or its allies. In return, Zaza received the one thing his wealth alone could not consistently buy: a form of political impunity. His connections within P2 and the associated Gladio stay-behind networks acted as a powerful shield, ensuring that investigations into his activities were mysteriously sidetracked, that key evidence would go missing, and that well-placed individuals would intervene on his behalf at the highest levels of government and the judiciary. This symbiotic relationship between high-level state subversion and low-level organized crime created a monster. Zaza was no longer just a mafia boss. He had become a tool of a deep state, a force that operated above the law in the name of preserving the state itself. This alliance allowed his empire to flourish at a time when it should have been most vulnerable, granting him a degree of protection that insulated him from the initial, fledgling efforts of magistrates like Giovanni Falcone. It was the ultimate corruption, the point where the criminal underworld and the political upperworld fused into a single, indistinguishable entity, both exploiting the other for their own ends. Zaza believed he was using the politicians, but in reality, he was a pawn in a much larger and more dangerous game, one where he was ultimately expendable. When the P2 scandal finally erupted into public view, the network collapsed, and the protection vanished almost overnight, leaving Zaza exposed and vulnerable to the very justice he thought he had rendered obsolete. This chapter of his life is perhaps the most disturbing, for it reveals that the greatest threat to democracy is not the lone criminal, but the shadowy convergence of crime and state power, a collaboration where the Michele Zazas of the world are both the beneficiaries and the ultimate victims, used by powerful interests and then discarded when they become a liability, a stark reminder that in the grand chessboard of geopolitics, Even a kingpin can be nothing more than a pawn. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, having traversed the tumultuous life and legacy of Michele Zaza, from the desperate streets of post-war Naples to the pinnacle of international criminal power, and finally to his lonely, ignominious death and the systematic dismantling of everything he had built. His story is far more than a simple chronicle of crime. It is a profound and multifaceted parable for our modern world, a stark exploration of the intoxicating allure of power, the corrupting nature of absolute wealth, and the inherent fragility of empires constructed on a foundation of violence and fear. Zaza was a man of his time, a product of a specific historical moment of chaos and opportunity, but the lessons he embodies are timeless. He demonstrated with terrifying clarity that organized crime is not a primitive, atavistic force, but a highly adaptive, sophisticated, and innovative enterprise, one that often mirrors, and in some cases pioneers, the strategies of legitimate global business. His corporate approach to smuggling, his understanding of international finance, and his strategic political alliances prefigured the operations of modern transnational criminal syndicates and even the methods of some corrupt multinational corporations. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the very nature of power and success in our societies. He was, by the twisted metrics of his world, phenomenally successful, yet his story is one of abject failure, the failure to find peace, the failure to secure a legacy, the failure to protect his family, and the ultimate failure to escape the consequences of his own actions. The complete and total confiscation of his assets stands as a powerful symbol, a declaration by the state that ill-gotten gains are merely a temporary loan, a debt that will eventually be called in. The repurposing of his villas for social use is a poetic and powerful act of reclamation, a message that the community can and will heal from the wounds inflicted by such men. Yet, his legacy is also a warning that remains acutely relevant. The Camorra did not die with him. It evolved, becoming more fragmented, more violent, and in some ways more resilient. The global criminal landscape is now populated by his intellectual heirs, men and women who have studied his methods and learned from his mistakes, operating in the dark corners of our interconnected world. The battle he represented is not over. It has simply changed its form. It is a perpetual struggle for the soul of our economies and our political systems. A fight against the corrosive influence of illicit wealth and the shadowy alliances between crime and power. The story of Michele Zaza, the shark, is therefore not a closed book. It is a cautionary tale that we must continue to read and reread, a reminder that the pursuit of power without principle and wealth without morality leads only to a hollow and self-destructive end. It is a testament to the courage of those who stand against such darkness. The magistrates, the police, the journalists, and the ordinary citizens who refuse to be silenced. If this deep dive into the heart of a hidden history has captivated you, if it has shed light on the complex forces that shape our world, then we invite you to join us on this continuing journey of discovery. Please support our mission to unearth these forgotten stories by liking this video, sharing your reflections in the comments, and subscribing to the channel. Your engagement empowers us to dedicate the countless hours of research and narration required to bring these comprehensive narratives to life. Thank you for your time, for your curiosity, and for venturing into the shadows with us. The story of Michele Zaza is over, but the search for understanding and the vigilance it demands continues unabated.